Welcome to our discussion today on houseplant propagation. My name is Aaron Stile. I'm the Consumer Horticulture Extension Specialist at Iowa State University, and I'm very happy today to be talking to you about how to propagate your own houseplants at home. We're going to start here by talking about why we propagate houseplants. Of course, the biggest thing is to make more plants. We can grow our collections, we can share them with friends, we can even donate them to worthy causes. The other benefit to propagating is it's often a great way to reutilize the stuff that we trim off when we're trying to improve the appearance of a leggy or overgrown or misshapen or lopsided houseplant. So when those things happen, not only when we cut them back, not only can we improve the appearance of those plants, but then we can also utilize the stuff that we remove to make more plants, which of course is always nice. And then for many people, the process of propagating is fun. It can even be kind of meditative. So today we're going to talk more specifically about some of the things that you need to consider when propagating houseplants specifically, and some of the techniques that you'll use for all of those plants that grow indoors in your home. So the best time to propagate houseplants is going to be spring into early summer, but in reality we can do this anytime. Houseplants are growing somewhat throughout the year, although they are more actively growing in spring and summer, so propagating them at that time is ideal. But if we want or need to propagate them in the fall or winter, that's fine too for nearly all plants. The other thing we want to keep in mind is that we only want to propagate from healthy, vigorously growing plants. We don't want to propagate for anything that has a disease or insect or pest problem. We don't want to propagate from anything that's showing signs of virus like mottled leaves or weak growth. And just in general, we want to make sure that it has good, vigorous growth and isn't growing weakly or slowly. It's really easy to pass along, in particular, viruses, but also diseases and insect pests through the types of propagation we typically use for houseplants. And so starting off with good plants, good healthy plants, is really important, so we don't do that. Essentially, there are two major ways to propagate all plants. There's sexual and asexual. Sexual reproduction involves the pollination of a flower and the formation of seed. It's the recombination of genetic material. You can produce hybrids this way, and it can be a really efficient way to reproduce some plants, but for nearly all of our houseplants, sexual reproduction or seed reproduction doesn't work very well. We very rarely see flowers on many of our houseplants, let alone do they get pollinated and set fruit with seeds inside of them. So this just really isn't very practical. Instead, we tend to use asexual or vegetative forms of propagation. They're called vegetative because you're using vegetative pieces of a plant, like stems, leaves, or roots, to reproduce or create new plants that are genetic clones of the parent plant, which can be really beneficial. That means that the propagule will have the exact same characteristics as the parent plant, the same leaf color, the same flower color, the same habit, all of those kinds of things, which for many of us is what we're really looking for. And for most houseplants, the three most common forms of asexual reproduction that we'll use are division, cuttings, and layering. There are other forms like micropropagation or tissue culture. There's also grafting. Both of those are pretty challenging to do at home with limited experience and limited equipment. So we're left with division, cuttings, and layerings. And that's what I'm going to focus today on for our presentation. Let's start with division. This is probably the most straightforward one of the easiest ones to do. You're taking the entire plant and separating it into smaller entire pieces with leaves, roots, and shoots. Usually containers that are really crowded, plants that are very large, that have a basal growth habit or multiple stems coming out of the ground are good candidates for division. It's not always possible. You can't divide like a citrus tree. You can't saw it in half and expect both halves to live. But something like a spider plant or a Chinese evergreen can work really well by separating that root mass with leaves and stems attached into smaller pieces and separate smaller pieces. Sometimes we can use offsets, so plants will form like little pups or babies or plantlets, whatever you want to call them, offsets at the base or on the end of a rhizome, like with spider plant there in the lower right corner. We can use those, and they are usually fairly complete. They just need to be separated from the parent plant. To do this, you're going to pull the container or pull the plant out of the container. You're going to separate the root ball either with your fingers or hands. Sometimes you'll need like a saw or a knife. Heck, if it's really hard to separate, you could even use a Sawzall if you want to get out power tools. Most of the time, for many houseplants, your hands work just fine, or just a soil knife can work really well. And then you're going to pot those up, get them established in their new containers. One of the benefits is that you have relatively healthy plants right away. It's low stress on the parent plant, and you have a very high success rate. The only downsides to division is that we can very easily pass along disease or insect pests through this process, because everything comes with the insects and diseases that are on it, as well as the leaves, stems, and roots. And there's only so many plants you can get by using division. You can only divide it into so many pieces. And of course, the smaller the pieces, the longer it will take for that plant to recover and to grow to a size that will be helpful for you. Once that plant gets established in its new container, we put it in bright indirect light if we can. Make sure we water it in after we pot it up, and then water when it gets dry. After several weeks, we can then start fertilizing once it's fully established in the container. Many of us, when we think about propagating our houseplants, think about cuttings. Cuttings are when we take a vegetative piece of the plant, usually a stem, leaf, or root, typically stem or leaves for houseplants, and we put them under conditions, environmental conditions, that allow for the new roots or new shoots or both to form. And there are many different types of cuttings that you can take, and the best type of cutting, whether it's a piece of the stem, a piece of the leaf with the petiole, a leaf section, whatever it might be, the best piece to use for a cutting will depend on the species of plant. Certain species propagate better by stem cuttings, other species propagate better by leaf cuttings. So just a little bit of research on your plant will tell you what type of cutting is best to take. And we're going to talk a little bit about each of the more common ones here today. The benefits to this are the same benefits of all vegetative propagation. You get genetic clones. The benefit of cuttings over something like division is that you can use a lot less plant material. So if your plant is smaller, or if your plant can't physically be divided because it's not large enough, or it doesn't divide, it doesn't have multiple stems or a crown that can be split into several pieces, cuttings may be a really great option. The problem with cuttings is that sometimes certain problems can be passed along, especially viruses, and you have to provide these very specialized environmental conditions. Primarily, they have to be high humidity, bright indirect light, and warm temperatures to have the most success. And sometimes that's really hard to do at home, but we'll talk about some things that you can do to make that happen. When we take a cutting, we take that piece and we place it in a media. And the type of media that we use can vary, and often the media that we choose is really a personal preference on the gardener. Each of these has their positives and negatives, but ideally we want a rooting media that has a good balance of water and air holding capacity. And typically they need to hold more air than the average potting soil. So perlite, sand, vermiculite, and coarse sphagnum moss are great options for a lot of folks, especially perlite and sand are a great option for a lot of folks to use to propagate houseplants at home. Peat moss can work really well, especially when it's mixed with something else. Some popular mixes are like peat moss and sand, peat moss and perlite. It holds a little bit more moisture, so we're not watering as often, but it still has good amount of air holding capacity, which is really important for those new roots to develop. Potting soil can be used for especially easy to root species, but you usually have to amend it with perlite or vermiculite to increase the air holding capacity. Straight potting soil often doesn't work. And garden soil doesn't work well for this. So you want to avoid using garden soil for all of our houseplants. We don't want to plant them in garden soil, and we don't want to root them in garden soil either. Many times you will find people talking about rooting cuttings in water, and this is certainly an option for a lot of houseplants. Many houseplants root very easily in a glass of water. The thing to keep in mind with water, rooting in water, is that the roots that develop from this form of rooting are typically more coarse, and so when you finally pot this thing up in potting soil, it often will kind of pout a little, suffer a little before it gets fully established because those roots because they're more coarse. So keep that in mind. We're gonna make sure we change the water often, once or twice a week. Typically, most things that are stuck in water will begin forming roots after 3 or 4 weeks. It might take a little bit longer. It might be a little bit sooner. Once those roots are about an inch long, that's when we can pot them up in potting soil and start growing them out. Just know that when we put them in the potting soil, they may wilt frequently, and it may take them just a little bit longer to get established than they would if they were rooted in something like perlite. One of the most important environmental considerations when we're taking any type of cutting, no matter if it's a stem or a leaf or something else, is that we have to figure out how to decrease the water loss. These cuttings don't have any roots in most cases. And so with most of our houseplants, we're taking a stem cutting or a leaf cutting, and then we're trying to get it to form new roots and sometimes new shoots. And while that cutting doesn't have any roots, it needs to have moisture somehow, and it's not very good about pulling that up because there's no roots. So we have to decrease water loss in a couple of different ways. First off, we want to start with well-hydrated cuttings. Water the plant the day before you take cuttings so that those stems and leaves are fully hydrated and not starting off at a deficit. We want to stick cuttings as quickly as possible. If we can't do it right away, we want to store them in a cool, moist environment with the ends wrapped up in a moist paper towel. Not too wet, we don't want mold to form, but we want to make sure that they don't dry out while they're waiting to be stuck in rooting media, whether that's water or whether that's something like perlite or vermiculite or a mixture of sphagnum moss and sand or something like that. One of the things we can do for really large leaf plants is reduce the surface area of the leaf by cutting the leaf in half or reducing the size of the leaf. This can reduce the amount of transpiration, so this is water loss through the leaf. It's an important process for plants, but when you don't have roots to bring up water, you can lose a lot more water through transpiration than you can replace through water absorption at the base. So we want to reduce that by reducing the leaf size on some of the big ones. And probably the most important thing to do to help decrease water loss is to increase humidity. High humidity for rooting cuttings is essential, and it's one of the hardest things for us to do at home. In a commercial setting or in a greenhouse setting, we'd set up a mist bench, and we'd have misters that go off for 10 seconds every 2 or 3 minutes that raises the humidity and constantly hydrates those cuttings that don't have any root systems yet. But at home, we don't have systems like that. So we can use other things to help raise humidity, namely by covering the cuttings and trapping in the moisture with a plastic dome, a plastic cup, a plastic bag. We want to make sure that we support it so that it's not laying on the cuttings themselves. So you can use chopsticks or wire or some other contraption like straws or whatever to keep that plastic up. We want to make sure that it allows light in because we do need light for these plants as well. But putting that covering or that bag or something over the plant is really beneficial in raising humidity. And humidity is one of the hardest things for us to do at home, to have high humidity situations, but it is one of the most important for cuttings to be successful. Some other things we can do to help cuttings be successful is use rooting hormones. So they come in powders or liquids. Powders tend to be a bit more common than liquids, but they're both out there. They are synthetic auxins, and IBA and NAA, so idobutyric acid is IBA, and naphthaletic acid is NAA. Those are mouthfuls, so we just often refer to them as those acronyms. Those come in different concentrations, and the concentration varies because certain cuttings are going to respond better to higher or lower concentrations of these auxins. These auxins promote the formation of advantageous roots Often we want those roots to form as quickly as possible so that the cutting can bring up water and start growing right away. Application method is important. When we use powdered rooting hormone in particular, we always want to pour a small amount into a cup or onto a plate and dip into that. We're going to dust the bottom of the cutting. Sometimes you can wet the bottom of the cutting to allow the powder to stick a little bit better. Don't put too much on. If some is good, more is not necessarily better. In fact, too much rooting hormone in some species can actually hinder rooting. So keep that in mind. We don't want to put on too much. Follow the directions as they're listed there. And then if we're using a liquid, we're going to submerge the bottom of the cutting in that rooting hormone for 5 to 10 seconds and then stick them in the rooting media. Never reuse that powder. That's why we're putting it in a small cup or a plate, because it's really easy to pass along disease issues or other problems if we stick directly into our container. You want to store rooting hormone in a cool, dark location, and keep in mind that rooting hormone does expire. It loses its efficacy over time, and typically, once rooting hormone's more than a couple of years old, it's not nearly as effective as newer rooting hormone would be. So don't keep using the same rooting hormone year after year after year after year. About every 2, probably 3 or 4 years would be okay for the average home gardener. You'll want to replace that rooting hormone. And then, of course, setting up ideal environmental conditions. We already talked a lot about the humidity. That's a very important environmental consideration for successful rooting of your cuttings. But there are a couple other things to keep in mind too. We need bright and direct light. We don't want really intense light, especially if we have a plastic bag or a plastic dome over those cuttings, because that can really magnify and trap in heat, which can cause damage to the cuttings. So bright indirect light is the best. Something that is indoors, it's going to be something that's near a window, but not in the direct sunshine. That can work really well for cuttings. And then we want to try to have nice warm temperatures. Air temperatures between 65 and 75 are ideal. If we can warm the rooting media using like a germination mat or a heat mat, often we use them for helping seeds germinate. It works well for promoting rooting as well. And if we can get the media up to 75 degrees, heck, even 80 degrees, we can often see faster and more complete rooting in our cuttings. So temperature, light, and humidity are the 3 factors that we are most concerned with providing the best environmental conditions for to create our cuttings. Now, I want to go through some of the process of some of the more popular types of cuttings that we might take for our houseplants at home. Keep in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, the species will dictate which type of cutting works best. And so do just a little bit of research. We know that things like African violet work really well with leaf petiole cuttings, but coleus and geranium work really well with stem cuttings. Keep that in mind. Do a little bit of research, find out which form is best. For many of our houseplants, stem cuttings work really well. We're going to take about a 3 to 6 inch piece of the stem. We want to make sure that it has at least 2 nodes on it, so 2 separate spots where leaves attach to the stem. And if we have maybe 3 or 4, that can be a little bit better. We can have 2 in the rooting media and 2 that have leaves on them. That can work really well. We don't want them to be too big. That's a lot to support. Remember, we want to reduce water loss. If we have this huge cutting, there's a lot more water that's lost through that cutting. So 3 to 6 inches is ideal for nearly all plants. It's usually the tip of the stem, but it can be a section in between. Just make sure that if you do try to root a section in between, that you keep track of which end is up, because cuttings will not root upside down. So do what you need to do. Stay organized so that your cuttings don't accidentally get stuck upside down if you're using in-between segments instead of just the tips. You're going to trim that down. Sometimes those nodes will already have roots started, like that picture in the center, but often there's nothing there. So we're going to remove the lower leaves because we don't want to put leaves in water or rooting media. We're going to treat that with a rooting hormone if we want, and then stick it in the rooting media. It's always best to wet rooting media before you get started. It allows you to more easily stick the cuttings. And then put them under those environmental conditions we just talked about. And most stem cuttings will root in 3 to 6 weeks. Depends on the plant, depends on the conditions that they're in, but that's a general rule of thumb. Once you have adequate roots, you can pull it out of the rooting media, pot it up in potting soil, get it established, and then start caring for it normally with regular watering and fertilizing and those kinds of things. Some plants, like Dieffenbachia, can be propagated using stem section or cane cuttings. So those plants that have really big, fleshy, thick stems can be used just the stem itself. We want to make sure that it has at least 2 nodes on it, so that those little nodes there on that left picture are circled. That's what we're looking for there. We want at least 2, 3 or 4 might be better in this case. And then we're going to lay that section down on its side in the rooting media, whether that's perlite or really well-drained potting soil, and then almost cover, but not quite cover it all up. We can put rooting hormone on the bottom side of that, and then place it under those environmental conditions, humid, warm, bright and direct light, and wait for new roots and shoots to form, usually in about 8 to 10 weeks. Depends on the plant, depends on the conditions. Once they have formed, you can pot it up, get it established, and use it, care for it as normal. Sometimes we'll do stem section cuttings vertically as well, like in that right picture there. Some of this is personal preference, and sometimes trial and error kind of shows you which works best for you. For most gardeners, horizontally for this type of propagation tends to work better. There are some plants, most notably African violet, that propagate very easily from leaf petiole cuttings. So this is the leaf blade plus the petiole. The petiole needs to be present on some species because it contains the cells that are necessary to promote those new advantageous roots and shoots to form. The blade alone doesn't. So we need to make sure that that little leaf stem, the petiole, is attached. You're going to remove that, make sure there's an inch or an inch and a half, if there can be, of that leaf petiole attached to that leaf. And treat it with a rooting hormone, and then stick it in the rooting media with the petiole buried and part of the leaf blade. We'll water that in, put it under those environmental conditions we've talked about, high humidity, warm temperatures, bright and direct light. And then typically we're going to see new roots form in maybe 3 to 4 weeks, and new shoots or little plantlets form in about 6 to 8 weeks. And once that happens, we can then pull them out of the rooting media and pot them up. It's often beneficial to set that leaf at a slight angle. That usually helps the rooting a little bit. It also helps you separate the plantlets, because there are some species where you'll get multiple plants that form at the base of that petiole, and you'll probably want to pull them gently apart before you pot them up. Pot them up, get them established, then start your regular care. There are some species, notably begonias, many of the Rex begonias and some of the others, that propagate really easily from leaf cuttings. So this is where we take the blade, the leaf blade, and then we're going to damage or cut the veins on the underside of that leaf in a couple of different places. We're going to lay that leaf blade flat on the rooting media with the veins down. We'll probably have to pin it down with like a hairpin or a piece of wire, a paper clip. Florist pins work really well if you can find those to help hold that cut piece of the vein against the rooting media, and a new plantlet will form at that vein. So we get new roots that form, new plants that form, typically with the same kind of timeline as leaf petiole cuttings. So about 6 to 8 weeks, maybe a little bit longer depending on the environmental conditions. You'll have a little plantlet large enough that you can separate it out, pot it up, and grow it on to a complete and larger plant. And then there are a few plants, most notably snake plant or Sansevieria, that do really well with leaf section cuttings. So rather than using the entire leaf, which on this plant can be quite large, we're going to use a piece of the leaf. And we can get a lot of propagules out of one leaf this way. Thing to keep in mind with leaf section cuttings is, just like with stem cuttings, they won't root upside down. So you need to be able to keep track of which end is up. Often, gardeners will cut the bottom straight across and then cut a notch or the top at an angle, and it allows you to keep track of which end is up, because if you stick it upside down, it won't root. We're going to put that in the media, like a 3 to 4 inch section of leaf. We're going to put about half of it into the rooting media. We're going to dust it with rooting hormone, although some plants like snake plant root pretty readily even without rooting hormone. And then wait for those new roots and shoots to form, typically in about 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the conditions and the species. Once those new shoots and roots form, we can pot that up. Once those new roots and shoots form, we can also cut out that leaf section if we don't like the way that it looks, or you can leave it there too. It doesn't really matter. Most of us will end up cutting it out because we don't like the way that it looks. The same holds true for leaf cuttings as well. Once we pull that little plantlet out and it has shoots and roots, we can get rid of the original leaf, whether we cut it away carefully or it just falls away. All right, so that was a big overview of cutting specifically for our houseplants. The other form of propagation that we use frequently for houseplants is layering. And layering is very similar to cuttings. The biggest difference is we are using a vegetative part of the plant, usually a stem, but sometimes other pieces. We're using a vegetative part of the plant to form, and getting it to form new roots and sometimes shoots before we cut it off of the parent plant. So cuttings, we take those pieces off of the parent plant, put it in specialized conditions. In layering, we get it to form new roots, and then we take it off of the parent plant. And there's some real advantages to this. You don't have to worry as much about the environmental conditions because it's still being supported by the parent plant. It's not all on its own like a cutting is. But there are some downsides too. In particular, not all plants lend themselves very well to this method of propagation. They don't have stems long enough. They don't have stems flexible enough. They don't have the growth habit that allows for this to work. So, what does this look like? There's two major types. There's actually quite a few different ways that we can layer plants, but in our house plants, there's two different types we typically use. The first one I want to mention is simple layering. This is where we take a piece of stem and we bend it over. We pin it down to a rooting media, usually just a potting soil is fine. We try to bury that part of the stem. We can even damage it a little bit, like nick it or scrape it. That can help promote even more root formation at that spot. We'll bury it a couple inches under that potting soil. Usually you have to pin it down with a florist pin or a landscape pin or a paper clip or something like a bent paper clip or something like that to keep it firmly in place with the rooting media. Once those new roots form, you can remove it, cut it off of the parent plant, and you have a complete and separate plant. This works really well for leggy plants. Cuttings are great for leggy plants, but if we have really kind of lanky, long stems that we're trying to reduce anyway, simple layering can work really well. When we do put that piece into the soil to get it to root, it's often quite beneficial not only to nick it or to damage it at that spot, but also to bend it slightly. And the reason why that's beneficial is because at that bend or at that damage that you create, carbohydrates and other compounds will start to gather or pool in that location. In particular, certain types of plant hormones will too. And that will promote better root formation at that spot. So if we can do that, that can really help kind of speed up the process and allow us to get cuttings or get roots to form more quickly. Sometimes we have a situation where the plant doesn't have flexible stems and we can't bend it or move it into a spot where it can be in contact with soil or another rooting media to form those roots before we cut it off. And then there are some plants that if we try to take cuttings, the cuttings just die before they actually root. And so when we have a situation like that, we can use air layering. And air layering is a process that works really well, especially for things like ficus, fiddle-leaf fig, weeping fig, rubber tree. Dracaena works really well with this. There are other things like citrus that can work really well with air layering. They all can develop leggy or lanky stems. So we want to prune them down anyway. And they're not flexible enough to kind of bend and put into a rooting media, so we can use air layering instead. So the way that this works is our first step is going to be to select a spot, usually about 12 to 18 inches from the top of the branch, and we're going to remove the leaves from that area. And then we're going to damage the stem in that area and put rooting hormone on it. And the way we damage the stem varies depending on what kind of plant it is. So if we're looking at a monocot like a Dracaena, that's what's here on the left. That one we're going to make an angled cut into the stem about 1/3, maybe 1/2, but a little closer to 1/3 of the way through the stem. And then we're going to prop open that cut with like a little toothpick or something. We're going to dust it with rooting hormone. That fifth picture there shows them supporting that cut. Because you've cut partway through the stem, it's possible that the top could be easily kind of snapped off, and we don't want that to happen. So they've used some twist ties and toothpicks to kind of put a little splint there to help support, make it structurally firm so it doesn't break off prematurely. If we're doing this to a dicot like a ficus or a citrus plant, we're going to actually girdle the whole stem. So you're going to make a ring around about 12 to 18 inches down. You're going to make a ring. Then you're going to go down about 1 inch or so, make another ring, and then draw a line down to connect them, and then remove that outer layer of bark all the way around the stem. Even kind of scrape away some of the soft tissue that might be left behind. That's the cambium. And we're going to dust that with rooting hormone. The important thing, this is really important because this damage or this girdling that we do to the stem allows for carbohydrates and other rooting hormones and naturally occurring compounds in the plant to gather at this spot and promote advantageous roots. Once we have that damage, we're going to wrap moist, coarse sphagnum moss around that damaged area and then secure it in place with a plastic bag and twist ties. We can also use saran wrap. We can use aluminum foil. Aluminum foil is nice because it kind of stays in place. Saran wrap does too for the most part without using twist ties, but it's more likely to dry out more quickly. And you can't see the roots forming. A lot of times we like to use clear plastic, although it doesn't have to be clear, but the clear is nice because then we can see when the roots have formed enough for us to separate it from the parent plant. You can also, rather than twist ties, you can also use cotton string or electrical tape to hold the bag in place. Whatever your preference is or whatever you have available will work. Start with moist sphagnum moss. Keep an eye on it. Add water by opening up the bag and dumping a little bit in to moisten that sphagnum moss. Make sure that it's always moist but not sopping wet, and wait for new roots to form. It typically takes 8 or so weeks. Again, it depends on the environmental conditions. It depends on the species of plant. But once those new roots are formed, you can kind of see them through the plastic bag. You can cut it off right below where the bag is attached. Remove the bag, remove some of the moss, get it planted into its new container, and you have your new plant. The last thing I want to talk about specifically when it comes to propagating houseplants vegetatively is propagating succulents. This is a really unique group of plants and a very popular group of plants right now. And propagating these propagating succulents looks very similar to what I just described, but there are a few key differences that I want to point out. When we're looking at division and offsets, especially cacti often produce little pups or offsets at the base, and simply pulling those off, or sometimes we do have to cut a little to get them separated from the base of the plant. Pulling them off with the stem and the leaves, or I'm sorry, the stem and the roots, allows us to have new plants basically right away. The challenge with a lot of these, though, is that they're full of spines. Whenever you're working with a really spiny succulent, you can wrap it in like a folded band of paper to help hold on to it. You're going to use and wear leather gloves potentially, or you can wrap it in a blanket or in a large, several layers of large sheets of newspaper that allows you to kind of hold on to it more easily without getting poked. When we talk about stem cuttings, they work very much like the stem cuttings we discussed earlier, whether it's a rosette form like that top picture there, or something that grows a bit more traditionally with stem and leaves all along it. you're going to take that cutting 3 to 6 inches long. The big difference here is that you're not going to stick the cutting right away. You're going to let that cut callus for 1 to even up to 3 days. And the reason why this is really important for succulents is that it allows that kind of cut end to kind of not heal, but seal over, callus over. And it's much less likely for that succulent to rot in that case. If we don't callus the stem before we stick the cuttings, often the cutting will rot and decay before new roots can form. But if we callus it, we don't see that. So that callusing is really important. The other thing, so we can before I go on to that, we can callus the stems by putting them on a paper plate, or just on a plate or a dish or a bowl or a counter. Just let them lay there. If it's a rather large cutting like that top one there, we can put it on a bowl or on a cup to allow it to sit without damaging the leaves for those 1 to 3 days to let that cut end callus over. The other thing to keep in mind when we're propagating succulents in particular with stem cuttings is that typically the conditions are going to be a little bit drier. And so we don't have the tight requirement for super high humidity like we would with a lot of our other house plants. And the rooting media can be a little bit drier too. It also means that it's really important that you select a very porous rooting medium, more like perlite or vermiculite, rather than something like potting soil or peat moss to root your stem cuttings in. Often we keep this the right moisture by misting, or heavily misting, or lightly watering on a less frequent basis than we would with some of our more typical houseplants like philodendron. And then I also want to talk a little bit about leaf cuttings. There are several different propagules that do really well from leaf cuttings. And the big thing to keep in mind with leaf cuttings is that you have to make sure that the entire leaf is there, including the little piece that attaches it to the stem, because that's where those cells exist that form those new roots and shoots. If we only take a partial leaf, so in that lower right-hand picture there, you see 2 leaves next to each other. One's a full leaf, one's just part of the leaf. That partial one is not going to root, ever. It'll just sit and rot, but it'll probably take over a month before you notice that it's a problem. So you want to make sure that you have that whole leaf. And then, just like with the stem cuttings, we're going to let them callus over, let them sit on the counter, sit on a plate, sit on a dish for a day or up to 3 days, maybe even a week, it depends. And then we'll lay those flat on the soil surface, making sure that the base of the leaf is in good contact with the rooting media, whether it's a really well-drained potting soil or something with a lot of peat in it, like a mixture of peat and vermiculite can work really well for this too, or just a really sharply drained soil can work really well. We're going to heavily mist the top of that soil and keep that top layer moist but not wet, and wait for those new roots and shoots to form. But that callusing is really important for those stem and leaf cuttings, and that's one of the biggest differences when we're propagating succulents. And propagating succulents is a lot of fun. They are super easy to propagate. It's one of the great things about growing these popular plants. I want to end our discussion here today by talking about some of the easiest houseplants to propagate. So if you're thinking about tiptoeing into the world of houseplant propagation and you have some of these plants, these would be the best ones to start with. So some of these are easy to root because they naturally have structures that easily become new plants. Like with spider plant, they have those little plantlets that form. Or with Chinese money plant, they readily form little offsets that are really easy to divide off. Or they could be something more like pothos, which roots very readily along the stem. These are some others that root very easily. You'll notice there's a lot of vining plants on this list because most of them very readily, a lot of them already have preformed little root initials at many of their nodes, and so when you put them in the right conditions, they root really quickly. And that's certainly true of things like philodendron and English ivy, tradescantia. They just root very readily on the stem. And some of them, like that mother of thousands, form little plantlets along the edge of their leaf, and they literally form little roots and everything. All you have to do is pot them up. The only challenging thing about that is that the plantlets are super tiny. So you have to be careful not to let them accidentally dry out too quickly. Thank you for joining me with this discussion. I hope this gives you some confidence and some excitement to go and try to propagate some of your houseplants, especially those houseplants that are maybe a little overgrown or a little lanky. Not only will you improve the appearance of the original plant, but you get more plants out of it too, which is always a nice thing. There are a lot more resources about this available at the Horton Home Pest News website from Iowa State University. The link there is on the screen, and that's also where you can find people to ask even more questions should you have them. So have fun out there propagating your houseplants at home. Thank you.